So let me pick up more or less where we left off. I think we talked a little bit about Studs Terkel and the kind of remarkably negative, notably negative view of work that he portrays here. Particularly the idea of work as a thing that does violence to your soul. And I'd like to think a little bit about that and say, you know, what is it that the Bible would have work do to your soul? Is it irrelevant to your soul? Does it do violence to your soul? Does it make you more like God? Does it make you less like God? What's good work? What's bad work? What's work that actually works from a biblical perspective? So that's what we want to really look at today. And let me just begin. I already said most of those things. By asking a few questions biblically and thinking about some things that I think probably I'm going to guess that I won't be saying a lot of things that you've never ever heard before. But hopefully I'll be collecting some things together that may not have all been put together in your mind as you've thought about work up to this point. That's really the goal, because there's not a lot of hidden verses, so to speak, that I'm looking for, but the implications of it oftentimes do remain hidden from us. So let me think first of all about whether or not work actually belongs in paradise. If you were to think of Stud Terkel's description, you would certainly say that does not sound like a thing that you would find in paradise, that would be part of the Garden of Eden. But as we look at it biblically, I think that is exactly what you find. So let me talk first about the, as it says here, the fact of work in paradise, namely that it did indeed occur there. If you were to read Genesis chapter 1, you would find when it comes time to create human beings, we're created in the image of God, male and female, He created them, but we were created to multiply, fill, rule, and subdue, which when you begin to think about it, actually in a sense are working kinds of terms. Multiply and fill in this context has the picture of having babies, roughly speaking, creating families, and populating, colonizing planet Earth. And those are the things I think we commonly associate with domestic labor. The building of human households that will actually be able to spread out and fill the earth. And unless you want to bracket all domestic work from work, which unfortunately I think our culture is prone to do, which I think is just simply ridiculous, but we tend to do it. But unless you want to make that kind of bracketing, then you suddenly realize, oh, if we're supposed to be doing multiplying and filling, we are doing work in that sense in paradise. And then ruling and subduing, those are classic sorts of management kinds of issues where you're taking the challenges or the opportunities that are presented and trying to maximize them. In current technology, those may be goods and services that you create. It may be technology that's developed. We have all kinds of other language to describe it. But most all of those words would be words we associate with work. These are things that you do to somehow make our world work better. So you have this whole domestic portion of work. You have ruling and subduing, which includes, in effect, making the environment in which you live habitable, transforming the world through technology and human effort, those sorts of things. And then in verse 29, you actually have the interesting statement that he gives to people like us, the animal world, every green plant for food. And you realize that the way things are created in the Garden of Eden are not so that we can gain our nourishment without working, but rather that we gain our nourishment only by working. So in other words, unlike a green plant, when you look at yourself in the mirror, you do not have green hair. When you may think, who cares if it's green? Well, I care if it's green, because green is the distinctive color of chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is what allows a plant to capture and metabolize energy from the sunlight. So plants don't have to work to eat. That is a very interesting difference between you and a plant. There's probably several others, but this one should be close to the top of your list. A plant is nourished simply by absorbing the sunlight that God gives. And the thing I'd like to point out is that there's no reason why God couldn't have given us green hair, so to speak. There's no reason why we couldn't have chlorophyll such that we could self-sustain without having to do any labor or anything to resemble that labor on all part. But that is exactly not how he set it up. He set it up so we have work rather than chlorophyll in order to feed ourselves. What do we feed ourselves off of? All those wonderful plants that do have chlorophyll. Interesting point. There's basically what the biologists will call anabolic and catabolic creatures. Anabolic that build up energy supplies, catabolic to eat them up. And you as carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, any kind of vor that you happen to be, are a classic example of someone who just, you're a parasite. You live off energy that someone else captured for you, namely a green plant. That is basically the one source of metabolizable energy that everybody has. You say, I don't eat green plants, I eat cows. Yes, but what does the cow eat? Green plants. So this is an entire system and framework that God has built for the sustenance of his creation. All of the created order is basically dependent on his provision. The interesting thing is his provision for us is to work by original creation design. That's the way we were planted in the beginning. In Genesis chapter 2, you have this interesting phrase. So Genesis chapter 2 in some ways is a recapitulation of Genesis chapter 1 with zooming in on the Adam and Eve characters. It isn't an alternative creation story as much as it is like one of those little close-up things they throw in the middle of the Super Bowl or the Olympics or something where you're seeing somebody do their thing, but then they come up close and personal, the ABC way or whoever it is who does those, and gives you the details. And you have a similar thing that God is doing in Genesis 2, up close and personal on Adam and Eve, in effect. And the interesting phrase that introduces it in verse 2, or chapter 2, verse 5, he says, and no shrub of the field had yet appeared on earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to work the ground. And again, you have this sense of God creating a creation that was meant to depend on and rely on each other. A synergistic creation. The plants feed us, but we tend the plants. And because we weren't yet there, he didn't want to create that cycle because the cycle was dependent on each other in that regard. So we were there, we needed to be there in order to, quote, tend the garden. So then in chapter 2, verse 7, the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. Now the Lord God planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So there it is. There's no man to tend the garden, so we have no garden. Now God creates a garden, and then he takes the man that he has formed and places him in the garden to do what? Well, to work, simply put. He's going to be a farmer. He's going to be an agriculturer, whatever you call a person who does agriculture. He's going to be one of them. And that's the picture that's painted. And again, the point of all this is in paradise, in the original creation, we worked. Work is a divine gift, not a divine curse. Having said that, of course, we come next to the fall. And in the fall, you have Adam and Eve obviously sinning. As a result, a word of judgment is spoken to them, and with it, a curse that falls upon them. And it's interesting to think of the framework I have just so carefully laid regarding the original design, the original commands to human beings, male and female, he creates them, and then we're supposed to multiply and fill, rule and subdue. That's the mission that comes to us, and those things attached to work. Really interesting to think about the curse. What happens in the curse? Well, Eve gets cursed, and where does the curse fall? What's going to get?
Childbirth.
Childbirth, which falls under what category from what I originally gave you? Yeah, that's a multiplying and filling activity. So where does the curse fall for Eve? Exactly on the distinctive part of work that she has to do in the most graphic of senses, in the sense of the domestic multiplying and filling sort of task. But that's where the curse falls for her. For Adam, where does the curse fall?
It's gardening.
Yeah. So back to that ruling, subduing, what's it going to be like to try and tend the garden, to make the garden, instead of be a pile of weeds, to be a garden, to be flourishing and thriving. That was his job before, just the way Eve that was his special job before, just the way Eve had some sense of a special job with multiplying and filling. Where did Eve's curse fall? Directly on her work aspect, her distinctive work aspect. Where does the curse fall for Adam? Exactly the same place. Notice that what happens in that context is not that it says, back in the garden, you were given the gift of work. Now that you've cursed, you no longer have to work. Not at all. The curse falls upon the things that you were still called on to do. It's just that now you will do them with greater pain, with greater anguish, with greater hardship than you would have had to do them by design. But in no way does it revoke the calling to work. That is assumed to continue because it would appear to be that as part of human design. At least thus far in our story, it seems like that was the thing that was just plain built into us and will therefore be with us always. So, work takes a turn, work gets twisted by the curse. Therefore, when you think of all the things that we said about Studs Terkel, or all the things that Studs Terkel said about work, you kind of nod your head and say, okay, he's describing the distinctively fallen elements of work. He's talking about the pain, the hardship, the sweat, the toil, all of those things that you see foreshadowed, so to speak, in the statements of the curse. Basically what Terkel is doing is pointing his finger at all those characteristics of human work and labor. What does that mean about our view of what he is saying biblically? Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think you guys did a pretty good job of talking about that last time, where we don't want to deny the fact that those elements are there, but we do want to argue for the fact that there's more to the story than simply the bad parts. There's good things that happen in work, or ought to happen in work, by God's design and intention. So, we have work in the original creation, we have work in the fallen creation. What about the future? Is there a future for work? We know there was a past for work. We know there's a present for work. Is there a future for work? And let me just make a few comments about this. This is the thing I think we tend to think less about. When we get to heaven, surely we'll retire. Well, will we? Will we? Let me just read the words of Isaiah describing the future state. And let me just, for the sake of being at a dispensational school that talks about premillennial eschatology, so you have a millennial kingdom before you have an eternal state. I hope this is all like frightfully clear because you've had theology too. But you have a millennial kingdom, you have a future state, an eternal state. And you have a nasty habit, just being honest, of biblical authors not always signaling their terms clearly with these things. So you may have language of new heaven and new earth associated with things that we would seem to clearly be part of the millennial kingdom, not part of the new heavens and new earth. I'm not going to worry a huge amount about that right now, but I want to read a description from Isaiah about this future state, be it the millennial kingdom or possibly even beyond that. He says, Isaiah 65 verse 21, "They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. For as the days of a tree, so will the days of my people be. My chosen ones will live long and enjoy the works of their hands. They will not toil in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune. For they will be a people blessed by the Lord, and their descendants will be with them." And this is part of a whole long description of what he calls a new heavens and new earth actually in that passage. I think generally we would assume that is associated with the millennial kingdom, but the point is it's some kind of eschatological future. But notice how colored his picture of why it is it's a paradise. What's a paradise? Paradisical? Why it's heavenly? I don't know. Anyhow, why it's a paradise is because of how good work is in that setting. Almost everything I read in those three verses was description of labor that was working right, not labor that had gone away. The picture is not of retirement, but of good work, not bad work. Work where you enjoy the fruit of your labor instead of someone else enjoying the fruit that you planted. And then finally, in the ultimate eternal state, Revelation 22. So this is clearly looking, whatever your eschatological distinctions are, looking all the way into the future, new heavens and new earth. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb, the tree of life for the healing of nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city. And here's the interesting phrase, and his servants shall serve him forever. Oh, wow. Guess what we get to do and be in the eternal state? Not unemployed. We're called to be servants who will serve him forever. And not a lot of details are spelled out about that. But notice this is in a framework where he's telling us about all the things that shall be no more. We find out the sea is no more in this context. We find out that there will no longer be any curse. All of these things are gone, but work is not gone. The point is our service is now directed directly back towards God, and we become his servants or serve him forever. Why do I go through this? Just to point this out. Work in the original creation, work in the fallen creation, work in the future creation of a millennial kingdom, work in the final state. No matter where you find it, when you find human beings, you find human beings working. It is part of our God-given design. And the question is not whether or not we work, but rather whether we do good work or whether we do bad work. That's really the question. And I think for most of us, we realize the answer of which of the two we're doing is never that simple. We often have quite an interesting mix of good and bad in our work situations, which is code word for welcome to the fallen world. And notice that's exactly what is eliminated as you move into the future state. That mixed quality of it becomes, in effect, all good. Questions or comments on that? I think it's an important thing to get right, because once that begins to crystallize in your mind, it forces you to evaluate certain other things about work differently. You're no longer asking whether or not do you do this, but rather how do we do this well? And that's the thing that I want to impress, that this isn't about it. And I guess maybe the other thing that I would like to point out is, what does this, let me just pose it as a question. What does this description I've just given of the theology of work imply about retirement? As a thing to shoot for. I can't wait till I retire, get my 20 years in so I can go to play golf every day, go to, what's that place on the Colorado River, Saugus or somewhere. What is that? Is there any implication of this at all for American kind of theology of retirement? Nothing? No implications? Talk to me. I see your head nodding or shaking, whichever is done.
I just keep thinking about John Piper's book, Don't Waste Your Life, and just his view of retirement and just the way it fits in the theology. And he was saying that those are some of the best years to continue working, to continue doing things to further the gospel. So that's kind of where my mind's going with
Okay.
that. I don't know how to theologically link that back together, but that's kind of where
That's in your head. Okay, good. So help out here a little bit. Let's connect a few more dots here. Piper points out that some of those later years may be some of the best years for working. We shouldn't be wasting our life. Good points. Other thoughts? How does that connect up? Yeah.
Our purpose doesn't stop as soon as we stop. Once we get to a certain age, our purpose is the same throughout our whole life, and so we are meant to work. Whether that work might look different as you get older, that's completely fine. As you get into your 60s, you might do more more discipleship or things like that, where it will look different than working in a workplace.
Yeah.
The American version of retirement is all about what you want to do and having fun and relaxing, and I think it shows a very skewed view of work as work is bad and fitting more in line with the original quote, and that work is a negative thing and the sooner you can leave it, the better. And retirement is the positive thing, instead of switching and realizing that no, we are made to work and we should continue to work.
That's a good point. I mean, the way we run away from work as if it's, I can't wait to leave it behind, really does give you the impression that perhaps this is like the Turkle view of work as opposed to the biblical view of work. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, I think that's kind of the essence of it. The thing that I would want to say is that if work is part of what it means to be human, then when you quit working, you are somehow losing something that helped make you human. And it's an interesting thing to actually consider when you look at the kind of statistics on retirement. The average life expectancy of a male, this is what I heard was for men, and I don't know what it is for women, but the average life expectancy of a man after he retires, if he literally retires, doesn't go to work anymore at all, just I'm going to live off my pension or whatever I've saved, 18 months. Is that weird or what? And the people who end up retiring longer, my dad's a good example of this. At age, I don't know what it was, probably maybe 70, maybe late 60s. My dad was like a compulsive worker guy. And I always thought, oh my gosh, Dad will go absolutely berserk if he ever retires. He'll have to run around and break things so he can fix things. And well, he retired. He and my mom moved into a kind of a retirement home sort of thing, different levels of living. And they're still, Dad's just had his 88th birthday, Mom is 91. But they live in this place that is adjacent to the church that they've gone to for years. And my dad, for the last 18 years, has been busily fixing everything from the boiler to the sprinklers to the whatever else. He's finally, in the last 2 years, because physically some of these things are becoming problematic for him. He's got some carpal tunnel things and some arthritis and stuff like that. So he finally has composed, with the help of another guy, the entire church manual for repair. Here's how to turn the boiler on and off and all these sorts of things, because he put in 18 years of volunteer labor at the church. So here's the question: did Dad quit working? It's like, are you kidding me? Did he quit getting paid? Yes, he quit getting paid. That he no longer does. In fact, it's kind of crazy how much work he does and doesn't get paid for it, but he didn't quit working. And therefore, he's happily and healthily 88. If he did quit working, I'm worried that he wouldn't have made it to 78. We're made, in some sense, to work. That doesn't mean you can't overwork and all those other kinds of things. Like anything else, you're made to eat, right? Can you overeat? Aha, yes, okay. So you're made to work and you can overwork. Yeah, Chelsea.
Well, I was just kind of saying the same thing. I have two great-grandparents, or great-grandpas, and they are pushing 90, and they're still working at the church, and they've retired 4 times.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
It's the fact that I don't know, I think it's the thought of retirement that people enjoy, but they never really do retire. Because even both of my great-grandmas, they still work, volunteer now at libraries and different things like that. It's just people never fully give up work, I think.
Yeah, and the point that I'm making is actually problematic when they do. Health-wise, relationship-wise, socially, there's so many things that kind of go wrong
One of my
when you do it.
great-grandparents has Alzheimer's really bad, and he gets so messed up at work, or working around the church and stuff, but it's what helps keep him sane, or what he thinks
Helps keep it together.
keeps it together.
Yeah, yeah. So anyhow, I want to plant that seed in your mind, because you're going to hear a lot of talk about retirement as like this vision for when you finally, and here's one of the things, when you finally get to do only the things you want to do. Let me say something just crazy. I'm not sure it's good for me to only do what I want to do. There's something wonderful about being needed. And when you're needed, by definition, that means you have to do things that have to be done because somebody else is counting on you. If you don't show up in the morning to do whatever it is you're called on to do, you'll be missed because some people are counting on you. I mean, it's true for me as a professor who teaches classes. There's a lot of other things I do as a professor. I've got 2 or 3 writing projects that I'd really like to be working on right now. And I've had a long summer, I've had a long semester, and I will get up on a Tuesday morning and not want to come to Biola. I would just like to go upstairs, turn on the computer, and start writing. But you know what? I'm teaching a class. I've got 30 students who are in some measure counting on me to be here. And my question is that good or bad? No matter what I feel like when the alarm goes off at 5:30 and I have to go pull my bike out and stick it in the back of my car, to drive 20 minutes to the train station, to ride for an hour on the train, to ride my bike for 20 minutes to get here, to show up here at class for 3 hours of teaching, to turn around and do that all over again, it's a really good thing. It's a really, really good thing. Part of me is every time I show up, I'm saying to you guys that you're worth it. The same way when you show up for me, you say, I'm worth it. And there's something wonderful about hearing from another human being that you're worth it. There really is. It's nice to be needed. It's good for us to be needed. And one of the things about retirement that I would like to say is it's perfectly fine. Like my dad, I have zero problem, and my mom I should say too. She doesn't fix sprinklers, but she was again active doing all those kinds of things and still is. It's perfectly fine not to be paid for something. But I don't know that you ever want to be in a place where no one is counting on you to do anything. That all you have is freedom and no obligations. That's what we call vacation. 2 weeks a year is probably enough. After that, you begin to become superfluous. And one of the real tragedies in our modern society is that we have figured out that one of the ways to disenfranchise people is to deny them their rights, which is a really bad thing to do. I just would like to point out another thing. Another really bad thing to do and a way to disenfranchise people is to deny them their responsibilities, to deny them their obligations, to look them in the eye and tell them, you know what? The ship of state will sail just fine without you. So just go ahead and sit on the deck and we'll feed you whenever you're hungry. We'll clean up after you if you make a mess, and all you need to do is ride. And you know what you've said? You are functionally optional on this ship. If you were to fall overboard, we just want you to know that we'd still get to port without any problem. Oh, thank you. I feel so much better now that I know that. We need to be needed. Work is all about that. And I would encourage you never to put yourself in a place where no one is counting on you for anything. Does that mean that you have to get up on mornings that you don't want to get up? Absolutely. Absolutely. Does that mean you'll have to say no to things that come up at the last minute that you would have loved to say yes to? Absolutely. That means that you work. It means that you work. And that's a really, really good thing. So, theology of work. Let me just, okay, so that's our framework of work in these 4 different contexts, before the fall in paradise, fallen creation, future creation, new creation. Let me just talk a little bit more about the goodness of work, why it is that a thing that is desirable, and here we have the goodness of work, and I would like to attach it here to God in particular. Here's one of the key and interesting questions is how in the world does our working connect to our godlikeness? In other words, the fact that we're made in the image of God, and you see that in the creation story. As soon as that word comes out of God's mouth, with it comes a job description. Multiply, fill, rule, and subdue. You're created in the image, so multiply, fill, rule, and subdue. Oh, wow. It seems deeply embedded in our godlikeness. So let me think a little bit about this. First, metaphorical names of God. This is a thing that we don't often think about. But have you ever thought about all the names of God in Scripture that attach to work kinds of tasks? Let me just read a few. God is a laborer, a builder, an architect, a doctor, healer, a teacher, a weaver, a gardener, a shepherd, a potter, a craftsman, a homemaker. You notice a theme in all of those things? God is described metaphorically with the name of a job. He is a tailor. So he makes the first thing that happens after the fall is that God makes clothing for Adam and Eve. Do you realize how crazy that is? God is serving Adam and Eve. Does serving another person dehumanize you? Does it degrade you? God chose to serve Adam and Eve, and the interesting thing is he did it by taking some coats, some pelts, some animal pelts, and stitching them into garments, because he took a look at their fig leaf program and thought, that is a loser. I mean, it's one thing to go shopping at Penny's instead of Saks Fifth Avenue. It's another thing to wear a fig leaf. So we are opting up. And so he breaks out the sewing machine and whips up some clothing for Adam and Eve to wear. But what is that? That's work. That's just classic work. God and the good/beautiful material world. One of the interesting things about God in general relative to the material world that we live in, which is a world that requires and is the context for doing all kinds of work, is how much he thinks that this world is good. He looks at the material creation and he kind of smiles and says, this is good. This is good. This is very good. He likes it so much that he seems to get up early in the morning, go over to Starbucks, snag a cup of coffee, and goes for a walk in the garden in the cool of the day. That seems to be his morning pattern. He probably picks up the little morning Heavenly Times, snags his coffee, goes out for a walk, thinking he'll find his best friends Adam and Eve to join him in a little chat. Of course, one day that doesn't work out so well, and we have the fall. But the picture painted before that is this God who really seems to enjoy a physical material created order. He likes this kind of a world. And so he's daily described admiring and enjoying the earth. He's planting a garden. He's walking the cool of day. He clothes man. He does all of those things. And the point I'm making here, this is radically different from sort of a Gnostic vision of the divine, of the supernatural, that would never get its fingers dirty. It's like having a Jesus who would never sweat. Because, it's just creepy to think of Jesus having to sweat, isn't it? Well, no, not really. It's hard to think of him hanging out with a bunch of fishermen in the middle of a climate like, Palestine without sweating. It was a labor sort of picture that you have that Christ was born into. He was a carpenter. He hung out with fishermen. It's a very gritty sort of an operation that is done there. Okay, yeah, and I'll come back to this one other thing I want to say about that in a second. There's kind of a symphony of work and rest and praise that goes on in the context of the garden. So work is in Genesis 1. You find God doing works in Genesis 1. But after he does them, he will stop and say, evening and morning, one day. And then he stops and he looks and says, that's a good thing. This is good. And my question is, why did God rest? Why did God stop? Not only at the end for the seventh day, but at the end of each individual day of work, he stops working. Was he tuckered out? I am so spent. Try lifting a few stars. It'll just kill you. My back, it's killing me. Is that what's going on in that description? And you kind of go, well, no, it clearly is not. And here's my thesis, that in some sense, work is never done until it's done well and praised for being good. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience of working on something, and once you've got it done, you get up like early the next morning and go and look at what you did. I do all kinds of stuff around the house. And so build in a bookcase, build a cabinet, build a fireplace mantle. I love doing things with my hands. Whenever I finish one of those projects, it's always the same thing. I stand back and admire and say, this is good. You make cabinet doors, and I don't know if you've ever thought of how many ways a door can go wrong, but there's like 1 million ways a door can go wrong. And so when you get all done making a door, if you hang it square and right and true, there's this incredible joy in just shutting the door and seeing the whole thing line up flush with the door casing. And then if you look at it face on, the door isn't, so it's like an 1/18 of an inch up top and an inch down at the bottom. It's just square and the whole thing made for it. I was talking about this once, and a friend of mine was in the class and he had worked as a roofer in college. He says, I so get that. At the end of every day, you lay maybe a third of a roof in a day. So at the end of the day, I'd walk down to the corner where I started, and I would sight along the lines just to make sure everything was straight in the shingles that I'd put on the roof. And it's just a way of looking back at your work and saying, well done. I did this job the way the job was supposed to be done, and you praise the work. It's good. It's good. It's very good. This is one of my little pet peeves. I think this is one of the most common crimes committed on the Biola campus. You are here as a student, and you are writing a paper. Because of various decisions that I won't bother questioning at the moment, you're writing that paper till 2:30 or 3 in the morning. You get up the next morning to print it out so you can be there in time for your 10 o'clock class. You run over to your printer has no ink. You're like, what do I do now? So you run up to the bookstore, you buy a little thing of ink, and then you run back to your dorm and you stick it in there and you print it out. And next thing you know, it's 9:58 and you're at least 5 minutes away from class, so you're running up to class, blowing on your ink so it won't smear when you hand it in to the professor, and poof, you pop it down and there's your finished product. And what is that? It's an unpraised paper. And I'm also just a little concerned that it might be an unpraiseworthy paper because it was written in such a rush. And if you're going to do work, do it so it will be worthy of praising. Do it so you're saying, I can't wait to get up tomorrow morning with a paper I've already printed out. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read through my paper before I hand it in, so that when I can hand it in, I can say, this is good. Yea, this is very good. And we have gotten into a habit of trying to figure out what the minimum daily requirement is. You'd think these were all vitamins. How few can I possibly take? And it's like, no, work is not designed to be that way. There's something wonderful about savoring the work when it is done, and that is exactly what God models for us in the work that he does in creation. He finishes something and then he stops and praises it before he goes on to the next activity. And I might also point out that that's also corrective to some of the excessive work policies we have, where we work and get a thing done, and then as soon as that's done, bam, we go to the next one, and then we go to the next one, and then we go to the next one, and it is never punctuated with praise. We just work and work and work and work and work. And we don't have a cycle of work, praise, rest, work, praise, rest, work, praise, rest. You would think instead of the God of the Bible, we have the God of the Energizer Bunny. Whack, 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 whack. More, 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 more. Faster, faster, faster. Harder, harder, harder. Back, 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 back. And there's a rhythmicness to the cycle of work in the biblical presentation that I think we're losing by hurry, by overwork, by undesire for good work, lack of desire for good work. These are the kinds of things, and I think that's one of the ways we take good work and make it bad, by doing those kinds of things to it. Mike Lefevre, one of the guys in Studs Terkel's book, he's the guy, I think I told you, mentioned him to you last time, the steelworker philosopher guy. And he just comes up with some great lines, and here's one of them. He's had all kinds of classic kick the dog, violence to the soul sorts of things to say. But he's sitting there talking to good old Studs, and he begins to wax eloquent. And here's what he has to say. He says, I would like to see a building, say the Empire State Building. I would like to see on the side of it a foot-wide strip from top to bottom with the name of every bricklayer, the name of every electrician, with all of the names. So when the guy walked by, he could take his son and say, see that? That's me over there on the 45th floor. He could take his son and say that. I put that steel beam in. Picasso can point to a painting. What can I point to? A writer can point to a book. Everybody should have something to point to. Isn't that a great line? And you know what he wants with his, I read this sometimes and people say, oh, he just, he's got an ego problem. I go, no, he doesn't. He has a very good view of work. That you should have this feeling when you're done that you can be proud of it in the sense of not I'm so great, but I've done good work. I have something that I can point to. This is what I've left behind. Wouldn't it be a great thing? Wouldn't it be a cool thing to have the name of every person who put a beam, wired a socket within the Empire State Building to have a thing that he can go and look at and say, see that, Johnny? That's me. I wired the 37th floor. It's a wonderful gift, and I think we much deny that. In fact, there's many things. Let me see if this actually comes up. Yeah, I don't know that this will come up later, so let me just mention it real quickly. Modern industrialization has done great violence to this principle, so that a craftsman no longer produces a product, but they produce a part for a product. So things are built on the assembly line kind of a process. And automobiles, this was an interesting thing that Henry Ford discovered. We can build it faster if one person only does doors and another person only does windows and another person only threads on the little button that you use for pulling the door latch up and down. And that's the way they built cars, and that's how they could build cars fast. But you know what happens? Is you go from having a skilled craftsman who produces cars to an unskilled worker who screws in bolts. And the feeling of difference between the two is enormous. And this built over the course of the 20th century until there was a small move, 70s and 80s, I think. Saab was the Swedish car company, was one of the ones who began to do some things differently this way, where they took a team of 6 people and they made the car, the people moved along with the car. And then when they actually put the car together, they assembled it. And I don't know that they took everything from beginning to end, but they basically traveled with the bulk of the car. And at the end of the time, they actually signed their car. So their names were attached to the vehicle that drove off the line. And they could look at this and say, that's my car. One of the things they found is they had a much higher quality control on those cars than they did with the other ones because it had these people's names upon it. You had something you could point to that made your work feel like it was worthwhile. So that's another thing that I think we want to take stock of as we think about what might make work good. And to kind of finish this part of the discussion, we imitate God when we do our work with excellence. This is a quote from Dorothy Sayers. I ask that work should be looked upon not as a necessary drudgery to be undergone for the purpose of making money, but as a way of life in which the nature of man should find its proper exercise and delight, and so fulfill itself to the glory of God. That it should in fact be thought of as a creative activity undertaken for the love of the work itself. And that man, made in God's image, should make things as God makes things, for the sake of doing well a thing that is well worth doing. It's a great line. For the sake of doing well a thing that is well worth doing. That's the goal. You look at what you've done and said, this was a good thing and I did it well. That's a really, really nice feeling to take home after a day of work. So this kind of is where God may be attaching to our work as a model for us in all these other sorts of ways. What's interesting is to think about what that entails for us as people made in God's image. And as I think I mentioned earlier, one of the really intriguing things is that our work, therefore, makes us like God rather than distinguishes us from God. And this is very, very different in terms of biblical theology than the kinds of mythological groundings of work you find in other religions. So for example, have you guys ever read or heard about the Enuma Elish creation epic, ancient Babylonian epic? You guys might have had it like an Old Testament introduction because it was sort of parallel to the time of Moses and in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 kinds of stories. Enuma Elish is a Babylonian creation epic. So, interesting thing about it. The way the story is told, did I talk to you? We might have talked about the original creation thing before with the big battle between the gods and blowing up the one god. Does that ring any bells? Did we talk about that in here? Okay, so Enuma Elish, I'll tell you the backstory then. You have this kind of family of gods. Mama God, Daddy God, and the baby gods. They're living up there in Godland. I mean, I'd say heaven, but it's not so heavenly compared to what we might think. And the bottom line is the kids are just a pain in the you-know-where. They're loud, they're obnoxious, they're breaking things. The dad finally gets upset and banishes all the kids from heaven, kicks them out. Mom doesn't like this. You kicked out my kids. What's wrong with you? And if I remember rightly, it's been a while since I've read the whole story, but I think she may actually turn around and kill dad. Whatever happens, it's bad. Maybe it's the son who kills dad. Yeah, I think it actually is the son who kills dad. So Kingu, the boy, comes back, the young male god, comes back, kills dad. Mom gets upset at the whole riffraff, and she decides it's time to assert herself a little bit. And so when you're thinking mom here, Tiamat is her name. Don't think, Mom, milk and chocolate chip cookies. Think Ursula the Sea Witch. So if you guys have seen Little Mermaid, you think Ursula coming out and snarling everything down, swallowing her up. This is Tiamat, big ugly woman. Disney would have loved her. So she is descending on the kids. Kingu is sitting here fighting her. She is about to just plain swallow him whole. So, enormous sea witch coming down upon poor little Kingu, the, god underneath. What's he going to do? And he looks over and hears the wind. He goes, I know what I'll do. So he captures the wind, and just as her enormous mouth is about to descend on him and crush him like a marshmallow, he throws the wind right up in her mouth. And it's like, oh! She catches the entire hurricane and she blows up. And so all of a sudden Tiamat breaks in half, explodes with the wind that's blown in, and then all of the other little kind of sub-gods that are rattling around up here in this god place throw a big party because they didn't like the sea witch either. Ursula was not nice, Tiamat was not nice, and so we're all happy they're having a party in heaven, and suddenly they realize, you smell that? Yeah, I smell that too. What is it? It's her dead body. Ooh, that's right. Big ugly sea witch just got blown up and now she's starting to smell. What are we going to do with it? I know. I'll rip her in half, and the top half I will throw up into the sky, and that will become the firmament, the heavens. And the bottom half we're going to wrap around and turn into the earth. So that is the place where we get the created order in which we live. It is the carcass, the stinking carcass of a dead god. That's where we live. Now, I want you to stop and think about how much you would like to participate in active digging your fingers into that vision of a created order. A little bit creepy to even think about. Now, the other interesting thing is that it does not end there, but it has its own story of where human beings fit in. So this is where the cosmos came from. What about you and me? Arteries I will not, and bring bones into them. And I will create Lulu, man be his name. And I will form Lulu, man, and let him be, listen to this, let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they, the gods, may freely breathe. And they bound him and held him before Ea and inflicted the penalty upon him. They severed his arteries, and from his blood he formed mankind, and imposed on man toil, and set the gods free. Notice the function that work is serving in this creation epic. It distinguishes human beings from gods. The gods have human beings exactly so that they do not have to work. And to the extent that a human being works, they are distancing themselves from God. They're becoming less like God because the distinctive feature of a God is that they do not have to work. And that would lead you to a kind of society in which the kings, rulers, and elite in the society did not have to work, and the people who were below them had to do their work for them. And if you ever read Plato in his Republic, or Aristotle in his descriptions of political society, you will find exactly that vision described. That the ruling elite should have leisure, and the last thing they should have to do is have a job, so to speak. That's why you have slaves, and actually an important part for both Plato and Aristotle was telling some kind of a mythic story that justifies having large quantities of slaves that do the labor for other people. Why? Because labor is an undesirable thing that distances you from God and makes you less godlike rather than more godlike. And notice how different the biblical story is. God the tailor, God the baker, God the butcher, God the candlestick maker, all down through Scripture, the work things that God does. And we join Him, we become like Him when we work, and we do our work well. So that is a really interesting tale. And you notice here that work is a burden and a punishment for human beings. It distinguishes man from gods, and it reinforces man's inferior and subordinate position. Biblical context, work is a blessing which is entrusted to man. It is a way in which we imitate God. In fact, exactly thinking of ruling, subduing, multiplying, filling, that is exactly because we are the crown piece of creation. We are God's vice regent. We're His representative on earth. We are the image of God in this location. And in order to fulfill that task, what do? We rule and subdue, we multiply and fill. That work is exactly part of how we image God in the created order of which we're a part. It's a reflection of our majesty over creation, not a reflection of our inferiority to the Creator. And to hear people talk about their jobs, you would think we read Enuma Elish rather than Genesis. We think of all those terrible things that are thrust upon us that we have to do that every day would seem to distance ourselves from God. Another thing, human beings work as God's agents in the created order. God often, almost always, mediates His provision to His dependent creation through His dependent creation. We are the agents of God's common grace. I think I probably said it before in this class, but the picture of Psalm 145 where He opens His hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing. But the way He does that is not by making steaks fall out of heaven, but rather by giving us people like herdsmen and shepherds and providing cows that we then tend, that we then make graze, that we then butcher from the butcher who may take them to the cook who cooks them so we can eat them. And likewise the grain, which is grown by the farmer, ground by the miller, cooked by the baker, and fed to us by the grocer. You realize it isn't manna falling from heaven, but rather a whole sequence of people working. So their hands and feet become the agents of God's common grace, the same way your lips are the agents of God's special grace when you preach the gospel. It is very, very parallel to gospel ministry, where yes, He could have made the rocks cry out, but He chose not to. And instead He wants you to do that. He does that with special grace. He does that with common grace. He mediates it through human creation. And so by and large, our work is exactly that. Our work should be distributing God's common grace to people who need it. And that should also give you a clue if you realize I look at my job and there's no real way for me to view this as gracious. I'm a drug dealer. Wow, that doesn't really sound like an agent of God's common grace, because when you give something to someone, though it satisfies a desire that they have, it is destructive of their body. You are doing harm, not good. It is not grace that you are extending, but rather actually a curse. And that's always a good thing to think about as you do the work that you do, or to ask yourself about a work you're thinking of doing. Is it actually a means of grace? And it's interesting to think about that in a modern capitalistic society where we have more money oftentimes than we need. I read a story about a woman who was a Christian who was a very successful designer, interior designer. And she finally quit her job because she'd gotten into kind of this niche. You know how that goes when you do something right and other people say, oh, I want you to do it. And after a while, you just have everybody comes to this person for doing some particular thing. Everybody started to come to her for designing bathrooms. She had whipped up this bathroom for somebody, $40,000 or $50,000 bathroom. And suddenly there's all these people who want to do it. It's totally honest, totally legitimate. No one was doing anything that was wrong legally. But after a while, she had this sick feeling that person after person after person, she was helping to spend the amount of money on their bathroom that would have provided an entire house for a needy person in a different part of town. And after a while, she thought, this is just not right. It's not good. I don't feel good about what I'm producing. Now, I don't want to universalize that, say everyone in the same position should feel the same way about the worth of what they were doing, but I do want to universalize that self-reflective attitude where you stop and say, wait a minute, do I honestly see this as good, or am I constantly sort of feeling sad about the way I'm getting rich? I'm getting rich for doing something that's actually squandering money in places where people really don't need to squander it, and I'm helping them do that. A friend of mine had to confront this when he was making furniture, cabinetry, and the casinos wanted to buy a bunch of his cabinets, and he could actually fund a whole business making cabinets for casinos. But you stop and think, how do I feel about that? Is that a thing I want to do? And I would like to point out, these aren't always easy questions. I mean, what's wrong with making cabinets? He makes good cabinets of a good quality. But do you want to end up in a place where all of your money, all of your time is going into making a casino successful? So you may struggle with those kinds of things. Good thing to think about. The design here is that we become an agent of God's common grace. Cotton Mather, American Puritan, so this is mid-1600s probably. But it is not lawful for a Christian ordinarily to live without some calling or another until infirmities have unhappily disabled him. Back to my point about retirement. He's saying until infirmities have disabled you from working, you should be working, roughly speaking. Indeed, a man cannot live without the help of other men. We work with one another, in other words. But how can a man reasonably look for the help of other men if he not be in some calling which is helpful to other men? So we work not only with others, we also work for one another. We're involved in this kind of mutual process of serving one another, extending common grace to one another through our work and through our daily labor. That's kind of the biblical vision for how those pieces should come together. And doing that also grants a dignity to a person. Obviously, to an extent, ruling over creation is somewhat of a princely function. We imitate God's, majesty, ruling authority when you do that. But also, real creative free work is a majestic thing. We alone, among all the created creatures, act upon our world and transform it. That's one of the distinctive features of human beings. I think I may have mentioned that before. Karl Marx is the guy who put it that way, but the observation is totally valid whether it's from Marx or somebody else. We change our world to accommodate ourselves. This shows our dignity in the sense that the world for us is not a given, it is an opportunity. It is not a boundary, in some senses our starting point. We exercise creative function in shaping it into new and different directions. It's a godlike sort of activity. We don't create it from nothing, which is completely godlike, but rather we take the starting points that God gives us and reshape. We separate ourselves from the rest of creation as we make, produce, subdue, fill, manage, and exercise dominion over the created order. So those are all things that we do with our work that, again, would make us more like, would make us more like God. So those are things that, like I say, just to try and get the biblical theology of this stuff right, how do we look at work? There it is. And it's notably different than the Studs Terkel kind of vision. And my hope would be that as you think of what do I want to do when I graduate, what do I want to do from here, that you're looking for some of these kinds of qualities in what you do, that you're asking yourself, how does this potential job serve the good of fellow human beings? And it may be several steps along the way. There's nothing wrong with that, particularly in our society where you have a lot of specialization. It may be 3 or 4 steps before the thing that you do has a tangible positive feedback for another human being. But the point is, by and large, no one's going to pay for it unless it does actually give them something that they need or want. And what you do is become the agency of basically connecting the goodness of creation with authentic human need. That's what we do in business, and that's what we do with work. Connect the goodness of creation with authentic human need, and thereby become an agent of God's common grace. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the biblical concept of calling itself. Where do you meet it in the Bible? What sort of a theology of calling might you have? And I don't think you guys have any notes on this part in your, so I'm guessing at least that you don't. Though it's related to the work stuff, it is a slightly different aspect on this. So biblically, when you talk about calling, generally speaking, you find the word call in the Bible associated with, for example, you're called to be holy as he is holy. Paul, an apostle, called by Christ Jesus. Some of these sorts of phraseologies. And, well, the number one way you would see call used is simply like calling somebody a name or calling someone to come here. So we all agree, very similar in English, that is the most prevalent use of the word calling. But when we begin to think of things that might attach more towards something important theologically or towards work, biblically you will usually use that word attached to the idea of salvation. So it is a call from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his glorious Son. That kind of a picture is being painted. And so people who are theologically sophisticated or biblically motivated or whatever will often say, well, you know what, attaching the idea of calling to work is just misguided biblically, because in the Bible, call does not refer to your job. It doesn't refer to your vocation in the way we use the term vocation, but rather it refers to a call to salvation, what is often called an effectual call from the Holy Spirit. Those whom he called, he foreknew, and those whom he foreknew, he predestined. And anyhow, that Romans 8, 28, 29, 30, that kind of a sequence. And particularly in that sequence, you have this picture that if called, then you will answer. And when you are answered, you're going to be justified and glorified and all those other kinds of things. It is a call to salvation, that it's a work of the Holy Spirit. And as I say, if you're a good Calvinist, you'll call it the effectual call, and it cannot be resisted. If he calls, you will answer, end of story. So there's a lot of theology that is kind of built around that, and it may well be very dismissive of attaching it to the notion of work. So part of what I'm about to talk through is a biblical theology of calling, but it's also a response to that posture that I have bumped into a lot, that is a little bit dismissive of the language of calling in connection to work. And I think that actually is one of those classic moves that's half right. And things that are half right are also therefore half wrong. And I would like to do some corrective of that theology, because I think it doesn't actually it discounts some things that I think really do count. So let me begin by talking about the word calling itself as you find it in the Bible. The New Testament word is kaleo, Old Testament kara. That term is in both cases used broadly in a way that's pretty analogous to the English use of the word call, and then it has specific theological overtones. And let me just read a section from Colin Brown, which is a classic theological dictionary, talking about what calling actually means. Now listen closely to this. Our word group does not occur in all accounts of the call of the judges. So you may have judges who are called to be a judge, but they don't have the word calling associated with it. And prophet accounts of their calling. It doesn't always occur in those either, but you think of a prophet having a call. He says this is because the call is not characterized by the use of certain phraseology, but by its content and form. And here's the point that I am making first of all, is just to say, when we're talking about calling and vocation and those kinds of notions, the important thing is to get a concept right. We're not really having a debate about how a particular word is used, The point is, how has that concept come across in Scripture? And so you'll find plenty of prophets who in effect receive a call from God, though the word calling is not actually in the paragraph in which the call is received, for example. So that's his point. And he says, certain phraseology, but by the content and form. What's the content and form? God speaks to a man or woman to whom in his foreknowledge he wishes to entrust a task. That's the interesting thing about his phraseology here, is that he speaks to a person whom in his foreknowledge he is foreknown and he wishes to entrust to that person a task. And notice that last part of it begins to suddenly have some of these overtones of the work kinds of things. We don't know what the task will be. In the case of prophets, it's always going to be some sort of a prophetic task. But it's interesting to note that this call is not only a call out of the world, but it seems to be a call unto some sort of task or job or thing that you do. It may be a prophetic one. It may be a political one. It talks about Cyrus in Isaiah being called. God has called him, though he knows him not. So Cyrus doesn't know God, but God has called him nonetheless. That is a picture painted of Cyrus in Isaiah, I guess, 45. So that is an interesting feature of that. I don't think I'll read all that discussion for the sake of time. New Testament usage. This is his definition of Paul's usage of, or explanation of Paul's usage of the word calling. Paul understands calling as the process by which God calls those whom he has already elected and appointed. So back to this foreknowledge kind of issue. Out of their bondage to this world, so that he may justify and sanctify them and bring them into his service. People he's foreknown, he wants to call them out of the bondage of this world. I already mentioned that usage of it when I was talking about calling passages. Called out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his glorious Son. So that he may justify and sanctify them. Notice all those things attached to salvation. And then this phrase, and bring them into his service. So again, you have this service element in both the New Testament and the Old Testament concept of calling. The one I just mentioned regarding the prophets or political leaders, the one I just described from Paul. So it's an interesting word in that sense to think about. And so let me talk a little bit, the word / concept, just to get this right. It'll take a couple of minutes, and then we want to tease out some of this for what would this mean for us in the context of work, and for you guys when you think of, I want to find my calling. I want to have the sense of what I'm really called to do. What in the world does that really mean, and how should you think about that? What should you expect? That's what I want to sort out. So, with calling, the interesting thing that is clear in these definitions is that it's somehow attached to the notion of election, of being chosen. And the idea here is that if you're going to be chosen, you must be chosen for a reason. So imagine this. Imagine I point at James and say, stand up, go ahead, stand up. Come up front. Now, stand. Now, I just want you to picture this. I begin talking about the issue of calling. I tell you some things about the Puritans. I talk about notions of how this has developed through the course of church history. We have a nice discussion about these different elements of calling. And then I look at my watch and say, oh, 4:15. Well, time to go. See y'all later. Anything that would seem weird about the afternoon class session if that was what happened from here? This poor blighter, right? What in the world is he doing up here? And you notice how weird it is to call someone for no reason. You can sit down now. It's just like, okay, why did he do that? And have you ever thought the idea that God just called me to save me is a little bit like calling James up front and then doing nothing with him? Why in the world did he elect me? Why did he choose me? Why did he call me? He called me for a purpose. Imagine being in a military review, 1,000 people in line, the general stands up, you salute, they salute, everyone at attention, and says, James, come forward. Pump, pump, pump. Out marches James right to the front, and then he dismisses the whole thing and he leaves. And poor old James is sitting there. That kind of an idea is just incoherent. You would never do that. You call for a purpose. You call to give a task. And that's as true of God as of military situations, as of me as a professor. I'm never going to call someone out for no reason if there's no task in mind. So the idea of calling and mission is kind of locked up together in the word. You call in order to send. You call out of in order to call unto. That's the picture that is being painted by this discussion. Another interesting thing about calling is that there's a somewhat paradoxical relationship between calling and freedom, liberation, choice. It's really kind of fun. I do this sometimes just to amuse myself, is read popular press, magazine kinds of things about finding your calling. And the idea is always this weird thing about, oh, I've got to find my calling, my true me. And the answer is almost always to look within. And if you guys were in, I think I mentioned this in chapel last week or something, but have you ever thought of how crazy that is? You know, to call yourself, breaking out the phone, hey Rick, how's it going? Oh, really good. How about you? Oh, fine. You know, what in the world sort of a calling is it when you call yourself? So then I'm going to go find my calling. I'm going to go quest for your calling. Where are you going to go? I'm going to go inside into the real me. What? Callings are answered, not found within yourself, and they come from without. They don't come from within. Otherwise, it's not a calling. And the other thing with God is that when He calls, there's not really some kind of option to say, I don't think so. I mean, you can always do that. I should be perfectly clear about that. But that involves rebellion. So you guys ever see the old Mission Impossible TV shows? With the kind of dun, 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 and then he, walks into some, sits down on the airplane and there's this little envelope and he opens it up, pushes a tape recorder, and what are the first words that always come out from the tape recorder? What does the person say? Yeah, your mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it. I just want you to picture Mission Impossible. And Jim says, no, pushes the button, turns off the computer. I'm out of here. Wait a minute. I just made a self-destructing tape and smuggled it on top of a 747 that's flying over the Atlantic, and you said, I don't think so. Don't say no, buddy. I'm giving you the job. You should accept it. I watched Mission Impossible as a kid, must have seen 10 years of that show. He never said no. So calling has about it a sense of compulsion and a sense of external demand being placed upon you. And we have a weird way of thinking about calling as a magical source of my own self-liberation and the true free me that gets to finally do whatever I want to do, and I just have to find my calling to find my true me. Wow. What if the general in question decides that even though you're a really good cook, we need some guys to go to the front? So instead of giving you a ladle, I'm going to give you a rifle. Because the point here is to win the war. Cooking's important, fighting's important, and right now we're long on cooks and short on soldiers. So here's your rifle. And I might point out vice versa. One friend of mine, older friend of mine, was in his teens and early 20s during World War II, and just like almost every other American teen or 20-ish person, when it came time to sign up, he was all in, baby. He was a gung-ho, patriotic American. I want to go fight the Nazis, and so he signed up. And they're, flipping through his little resume, and they find out, oh, dude's an accountant. You know what they did with him? They sent him to St. Louis for the duration of the war to fill out paychecks for the guys who were on the front, to send them to their wives and kids back in the States. That was his job, being a bookkeeper accountant in St. Louis for the entire duration of the war. And you know what? He was bummed. But after a while, he realized, the point here is to win the war. And if we're sending soldiers to the front who are afraid about their kids back home not eating, they're not going to be good soldiers. So we've got to do something with somebody to keep the wheels turning back home. And sorry, Bill, but you're going to St. Louis. And you're going to make paychecks happen for the next 4 years. Nobody cared about anything at that point except winning that war. But the point is, to win the war, they needed some people to do some things that didn't look like they were that exciting. What did you do during the war, Daddy? I was an accountant. Oh. Okay. What, couldn't you shoot straight? So that picture of calling, and to realize it has an external element and an element of compulsion, not simply an internal element and an element of freedom, is a wildly contrary notion to most American discussions of the issue of calling. But it, again, deeply rooted in biblical reflection, is that callings come from without, namely from God. They're attached to His purposes, not your preferences. And they come at His timing, not your timing. These are the kinds of problems with calling. You ever waited for a phone call? Yeah. I hate to break it to you, but God has this thing about kind of plopping people in the spiritual DMV, as I like to call it, the place where you go to wait for no apparent reason. God has one of those kind of just whipped up for each of us. And every now and then He just gives you a little message, report to the DMV, where you will await calling. And I think that happens to us a lot. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about what you do in those moments when you're looking for some clarification, because I don't think you just sit there and do nothing. But the idea that callings automatically come at the time you want to have them, and they will always describe something you want to do on the inside, is not a biblical notion of calling. If I were to summarize from all of this stuff, particularly the idea that this whole notion of calling moves beyond simply salvation. It certainly includes it in the salvation part of it is certainly the most essential part. But notice, as you think about it conceptually, it's going to have to include some other things other than merely being called out. So I would like to kind of identify three elements of calling: an internal aspect, an external aspect, and a personal or specific aspect. And let me just define them as follows. The Puritans would have identified a general and a specific calling, and what I'm really going to do is divide the general into two categories, my internal and external, and both of us would talk about a specific or personal. Internal calling attaches to that phrase that we just gave from Paul's definition, so that he may justify and sanctify. It's a call to salvation. If you look at it, for example, Romans 1:7, we are called to be saints. So we are called to be set apart ones, is what saint means. It's always understood as both a present reality and an ongoing process. So it's something that's already happened to you in the past, it's true of you in the present, and also an ongoing process. Salvation and sanctification, those two elements are always tied up in that notion, this internal notion of calling. In that sense, it attaches to your character and the transformation of your character. That's why I call it the internal part of calling. Obviously, it has entailments for external, but the focus here in terms of where the transformation is taking place is internal. You're regenerated, you have new life, you're born again, and you're also being transformed, renewed according to the image of the one to whom you've been called, Jesus Christ. There's also an external component to calling. From Paul's definition, where he justifies and sanctifies to bring them into his service. You're called for a purpose. You're called for a task. You think about this in the case of the Apostle Paul. He has this phrase, called to be an apostle. What is an apostle? Anybody know what the word means, apostle?
Messenger.
Yeah. Comes from the Greek word to send. A sent one is an apostle. So it's exactly this notion that I was just talking about. I don't just call James, I send him after having called him. So Paul was called to be a saint, but he was also sent as an apostle. And with that, he was sent with a particular mission, a task that he was fulfilled. As he describes it, to present all men complete in Christ, to put just really simple biblical language on. So from Colossians 1:28 and 29, that was basically his mission. I'm going to present all people complete in Christ. He talks about being called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. And In this case, it's referring to some sort of an office or mission for him. Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13:2 set apart Paul and Barnabas for the work unto which I have called them. And in this case, a missionary sending for those guys. So you notice that that is an external calling, and by that I simply mean you have to fulfill it by doing something outside of yourself. No amount of internal transformation, becoming more Christ-like or more holy, will make up for the fact that you aren't doing this thing to which you have been called or sent. So Paul had an internal calling to salvation, regeneration, out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his glorious Son. He had this external calling to be an apostle, a sent one who is going to be ministering on Christ's behalf. And then thirdly, he had a personal or a specific calling. And that is a part of this task that was unique to him, a personal aspect. So for example, when Paul talks about this, he says, look, I have this calling to do what you might call pioneer church planting. He likes to go where no man has gone before, right? That's his little special thing. And he, number one, does virgin territory, so to speak, where the gospel has not yet been preached. What's the other thing that's distinctive of Paul's ministry? Who does he go to talk to? Gentiles. So those two features are unique to him. Now, do you know anybody else who has a different calling? How about Peter? Who does he go to? Jews. So right there you realize, though they share a common external call, both of these guys are committed as apostles, they're spreading the gospel, their personal call is different. Peter has one to go to the Jews, Paul has one to go to the Gentiles. What about Titus and Timothy? You ever read Titus? This is why I left you in Crete, to kind of set right the things that have gone wrong. Anything gone wrong? He's like writing a letter back to Paul. Said, Paul, do you believe these guys? What a bunch of lazy slugs. And Paul's like, yes, that's right. Welcome to Crete. Even their own poet calls them lazy slugs. And I've sent you to tend to the lazy slugs. I've already been there, so guess what, Titus? You're not doing virgin church planting. You are doing non-virgin church tending. I left you there for a reason. So is Titus's mission in the big external picture the same as Paul's? Absolutely. He is also committed to presenting all people complete in Christ. What is his personal mission? Crete. Can I sign up for a different one? No. Why? Because callings don't come from within, they come from without. And in this case, that's where you've been sent. So you realize we may have common external calls in terms of the things we do. We have very different personal, specific callings, the way and the context in which we express them. So those are just some of the biblical parameters of this language usage, and I have a lot more comments on that if anybody has any questions. And the only thing I would point out is that there's some hint of the same kind of calling language used in the Bible for things beyond just kind of spiritual ministry kinds of calling, but rather things that attach to, let me just call them ordinary life circumstances, not Christian mission. So let me just read this section from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Only let everyone lead the life to which the Lord has assigned him, in which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Everyone should remain in the state in which he was called. Were you a slave when you were called? Never mind. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he was called in the Lord as a slave, as a freedman, who was called in the Lord as a slave, as a freedman in the Lord. Likewise, he was free when called as a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. So, brethren, in whatever state each was called, let him remain with God. And notice he's beginning to talk about interesting mix of things here that relate on the one hand to perhaps your ethnic markers of the circumcision, non-circumcision thing, but then also your circumstances in terms of your place in the social order as a slave. That's not exactly a job issue because being a slave was different than being a job, but it's not unrelated to it. It was a task and a situation he was in. And part of what he's saying is that, you know what, God kind of appoints these things. And don't worry about it. If you can find an opportunity to get out, that's great, but just don't worry about that because God has placed you where He wants you. It's not by accident, but by design that things are in the situation that you're in. And so He is applying that to things that might relate to life calling. A little bit later, he talks about the same kind of language in the context of marriage. Those who are called to be single or those who are called to marry. And again, it's one of those elements of, you think of what I already talked about with domestic life being part of work. This is another part where that kind of becomes attached to the notion of calling. So if I were to summarize the biblical use of calling, the primary focus of Scripture is generally on our internal calling, the call to salvation, or more technically, effectual calling. This calling includes both personal and universal elements. Some of this is very unique to the person, some of it is universal to all people. It includes both things that are attached to our being, our sanctification kinds of things, our internal things, and to our doing, the external call that we exercise outside ourselves, and also our personal specific aspect of that. So both being and doing seem to be included in this calling. And there's also parts of this, they're mutable and immutable. There's this whole debate about immutable calling. Should your calling ever change? And at this point, that doesn't seem to be a particular disease of modern Americans. So Paul talks about the call of God being irrevocable. In that context, he's actually referring more to this internal call issue, which is indeed, for most of us, we believe that the call to salvation isn't a thing that gets reversed later. So yes, that would be immutable. These other calls to particular tasks do indeed seem to be variable, even for Paul. His primary mission seems to be Gentile church planting. Does that mean he never shared with a Jew? Read Acts. He had plenty of conversations with Jews. Does that mean he never went back to a church he'd already gone to? Well, no, that was the first thing they did with their second missionary journey, is go back to the places they'd already seen. So you realize that it isn't one of these absolute categories. Sometimes he sees his mission as being, in a place that isn't virgin Gentile church planting. In other cases, it is, and there's room for flexibility on those things. Now let me just do a little bit of a Q&A, FAQ kind of a thing on calling. With this kind of foundation laid, let's think about how this kind of connects to ordinary life. In fact, actually, let me do this. Rather than just do my thought about the questions that might come up. Ooh, jackpot, a working marker. That is way too cool. Questions. So having laid some of this foundation for calling, what questions come up in your own mind when you think about the issue of calling for kind of where you're living right now with this issue? Things that you might want to get answered. Yeah, Brittany.
I feel like it's really abstract, this issue, but I guess how do you know when you're in God's calling?
Okay. Good question. How do you know you're where God wants you to be? You're in the place that God would have called you to. Good. What else? Yeah, Chris.
Maybe can you miss God's call?
Okay. So in some ways related to this. What else, Stephanie?
What if that calling then feels at odds with something else that you feel like you need to be somewhere else, but you also feel called?
Okay. So case is kind of a conflicted calling. Good. Yeah.
Is calling and spiritual gifts the same?
Ooh, good. How do they connect to each other? Yeah.
How do you recognize calling?
Okay, so, let me just put that down. It may lump up there, but So are you thinking, how do you recognize it or how do you discern it?
Because I feel like some people could think that they're called to something, but then does that mean that they're not called to it if there's no success in that ministry? But you can clearly see that Paul went places and he didn't have success. So like, what does it mean to be called? And does that mean you're going to have success? Or
Okay, good.
you have peace?
Yeah, so recognize is probably a well-chosen word there, because discerning is more on the front end of it. You're saying, how do you know in the midst of doing it if maybe you're kind of missing the boat or this person's missing the boat? Good. And probably, how do you discern it may be attached up here anyhow. So that we've got probably both of those covered in that list. What else? Any other calling questions, work calling questions you'd want to get answered?
Are we talking about calling specifically in relation to work, or just calling in general?
Probably calling in general. Well, as you can tell in the framework of this particular lecture, work is sort of an overshadowing issue, but I would like to just deal with calling on its own terms and not necessarily just force it into one aspect. So if you have related questions, that's fair game too.
Well, I don't know how to like word this, but I guess if never mind.
Okay, Sam.
If we could have multiple callings.
Ah, okay. Anything else? Yeah.
It's kind of related to like recognizing calling, but like how subjective and how objective is this sense of calling? Like,
Yeah, okay.
part of the discerning portion, but is it just like, oh, I have this feeling, or is it like thinking through objectively?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's
Okay, so, but that's a good point. That should be under here in terms of some of these things about recognizing the call or some of those things, but how subjective or objective it. Rematch, Brittany.
Okay, so that encouraged me to ask this, so I feel confident. If two people are in a relationship and one person says they feel called to this or that, and the other person doesn't feel that calling, or is that just a misuse of the word?
Well,
Because I feel like a lot of times Christians say, well, I feel called to be in a relationship, or I feel called to not be, or I feel called to go here.
see, and the thing I was going to say about that is that there's kind of this interesting, there's two different ways I hear that played out in a relational context. One is I feel called to this relationship. The other says I don't feel called to the relationship. The other is I feel called to be a missionary in Africa, and the other says I feel called not to ever go to Africa if I can avoid it. And so that latter one to me attaches more to this concept of calling. I'm called to the relationship. Until it is a marriage relationship, I'm a little reluctant to put too much of that part on
In
it.
terms of missionary
Yeah.
purposes.
Well, and incompatible directions that two people may have where I feel called here and you feel called there, and what do you do to make sense out of that? I mean, I think that is a pretty good use of the word calling, or pretty relevant use. Yeah. And a thorny problem too, a lot of times. So that's good to talk about. What else? Any other things? I'm probably running thin on time to talk about these things already, so let me run through a batch of things that are, I have some of these that are kind of, actually a lot of things you have here are the things that I had. I think what I'll do is run through this list, go back and look at that list and see where we are, if there's some pieces that are left over. And you can feel free to chime in as I go along, because this is a freebie. This isn't like for class, this is for you. This is a thing that I think is really important in life, and so ask the things that matter for where you're actually at. Let me pick up this thing about knowing when you're in your calling. Can you miss a calling? How do you identify or recognize your calling? And there's probably, well, 2 or 3 of these things are lumped together. Here's one way to ask it, and this maybe gets to Chris's point about objective versus subjectiveness on this thing. And really to ask the question, does everybody really have a specific calling? Or is that a thing that's unique to a guy like Isaiah, who has a vision of the temple in the temple, or is it unique to Paul or Jeremiah, these other people who really have this dramatic thing? Is there any reason to think that all of us would have a personal, specific element to our calling? So here's my thought on this. If the part of calling we're talking about now is this kind of specific personal calling, one of the things that you realize is that the Spirit has apportioned to each one individually as He wills a spiritual gift, which is what you were talking about. And gifts are meant not for your personal purpose, but for the service of other people. The gift is intended for the serving the body of Christ. So that almost means a gift comes not only with a set of abilities, but a job description attached, or a job need. In other words, you need to go deploy this gift in the context of something that looks like service. It may or may not be paid vocational service, but it is very much a job-like thing. You are having other people count on you to do something that is needed. That's the whole point of a spiritual gift. If it is not needed, it's not a gift, right? That's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 12. Every gift is needed. Everyone is needy. I cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Everyone is needed. There is no such thing as the less important body part, because those with less honor we bestow greater honor on, and all those other kinds of things. So we're all needed, we're all needy. So in the context of that, we realize spiritual gifts do have entailments for job work kinds of things, number one. And number two, they are apportioned by the active will of God. Apportioned to each one individually as He, the Holy Spirit, wills. So at that point you realize, wow, I certainly have a specific spiritual gift. Does that mean I have a specific spiritual task? Well, as long as there's a little bit of softness to the notion of specific, I think the answer to that question would probably be yes. You have a gift and there's an opportunity to teach in a particular setting or to serve or whatever it may be. You know, you need to do that. And those things are going to come together in some measure of a package. So I think the spiritual gift entails a task that is relatively specific and is indeed apportioned by God. I would also combine that statement with, for example, Ephesians chapter 2. Verse 10, where it says that He has good works prepared for us, in fact, before the foundations of the world, that we are to walk in them. So we have also these kind of predestined good works we are here to do, which again has a sense of there's some things you're here to do, not just something you're here to be, so to speak. It's specific. Psalm 139 is similar in this thing, where God says He knew each one of your days before one of them came to happen. He knit you together in your mother's womb. All these things have a lot of overtones of very specific creation and design on the part of God, with a sense of task associated with it. I would like to point out that sometimes I think we get overly specific about it. To go back to the general, poor old James, sorry about this, man, but you're going to become my standing example of the call for a purpose. I want you to imagine, you know, the general comes in and he calls out people for this assignment. You know, he's going to go send them behind enemy lines to go do whatever they're supposed to go do. And he sends the 6 people walking off, and then one of the guys looks around and says, "We don't have a radio officer." And you know, they pass it up line. You don't want to tell the general that because it looks stupid, but somebody finally slips him a little sheet of paper. "What about a radio officer?" And he goes, "Ooh, good idea." And so the general stands before these 100 people, these 100 soldiers gathered there, and says, "Who has a radio certification?" And 2 hands go up, and he says, "Okay, Sam, Stephanie, you're going with them. How did you get called? Because of a specific gift you had, though when you got the gift, it wasn't necessarily all predetermined for you to go on that plan, but that combines with your circumstance and situation where you happen to be, and in effect constitutes a very, very specific call." You understand how that works? So it isn't, I don't necessarily want to say all this thing is about attaching it all the way down to this place, that time, that moment, But the combination of this particular gift, aptitude, or whatever, with the location in which you happen to be and the needs in that location, may formulate to create a very specific sense of giftedness, or very specific sense of calling in your actual life circumstances. But notice it's a hybrid of external circumstances and personal calling, design, giftedness kinds of things. Yeah?
That's how it was explained to me by Dr. Birding. He said, like, if there's a need and you're capable of filling it, then you can do that. And it's not necessarily like you have some special gift and you just have to operate in
Right.
that. It's more like God's gifted us in many ways, and wherever there's a need, we should fill those needs if we can, if we're capable.
Yeah, we should be expecting him to apportion a gift. And for Ken especially, his view of the gift is really, it's almost just a task. It isn't a separate possession. It is a call to a job without even any mediating discussion really in that process. The gift means the doing of the task. And I'm fairly happy actually with that framework. That isn't necessarily how everybody talks about it, but I think the point is really, really well taken. So yeah. So in answer to the question here with the spiritual gift and the calling thing, I'd say, yeah, there actually is a connection between those. Now, that's a little different than saying I have the spiritual gift of teaching, therefore I need to have the vocational task of being a teacher. I think the spiritual giftedness really is, in its first focus, focused on the church. The fact that you might be well suited to doing that task in the church, it isn't exactly a leap or a stretch to think you might be well suited to doing that task out in the world as well. But I wouldn't want to necessarily make that an equal sign connecting those two, that whatever your spiritual gift is simply does translate into a secular talent for doing a particular kind of job or a secular call to do that kind of job. But I don't know that they would be unrelated. The thing that you're really saying is God has designed me in a certain way, and the person who built me is also the person who's calling me. So the likelihood that they will be fit well together, I think, is pretty high. So your gifts, your aptitudes, and your motivations are likely to line up, perhaps not perfectly, but are likely to line up with some task that God would have you do, because your creator is also your caller. So that's at least some measure of specificity for calling. I would think biblically you would say, yes, we really all have that, though not necessarily down to the fact that I should be teaching at Biola versus Wheaton versus Vanguard or something like that, or that I should be teaching in a church even versus teaching in a university. I've done both. And I didn't really feel like I was abandoning a call in one, even when I made the transition. I just feel like I was really continuing to serve God in the places that He opened doors for, and there isn't really a lot to be said about that to me. So I may have gone through a change in where my paycheck was coming from, but there isn't really a big change in terms of my sense of specific calling. Yeah, so there's that. Probably related to that. Well, any questions on that part? Okay. Questions on that? Yeah.
Would you say then that people can't really necessarily say, oh, I feel called? Like, I mean, some people, I guess, I've always been told, like, some people are like, oh, obviously there's a job opening, so I've been called to go to this because it's better pay, better that.
Yeah, sometimes I have this feeling like we would like to do away with wisdom by invoking calling, feeling, and circumstance. And I'm like, you know what? I'd like to not do away with wisdom. So I would like a person to have to bear a certain amount of weight for having made a decision. I have chosen to go to this place. And you may feel like there were so many things that were pressing you to do it that you could hardly do otherwise, and I'm okay with that. But I would like to argue that there's a very, very clear room. I mean, good grief, the whole book of Proverbs is written about wisdom. And what is wisdom for, if not wisdom of choosing? Wisdom is all about making good choices, and some of those are good choices about where do you live and work and locate yourself. So I think we sometimes get way overly wound up with trying to make everything explained by this calling and compulsion from God, rather than saying, I had 3 job opportunities and I chose the one that seemed wisest. Is that not a perfectly good biblical decision? I think it is. And the other thing, well, and I'll comment about this in a second in missing your calling. So let me just save it for that. Any other questions about that with the specific calling? Okay, let me talk about missing your calling. If you were to think about my three elements of calling, the internal call, the external call, and the specific and personal call, the internal call is a call to salvation and a call to sanctification. So is there ever a day when you wake up and say, gee, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be saved? Okay, hopefully not. Is there ever a day when you walk up and say, gee, I'm tired of being so holy, I think today I won't be holy? Okay, I recommend against that as well. So apparently we don't have a lot of questions swirling about our internal call, right? Pretty much nailed down. And what about our external call? Well, I'm not really sure if I do want to present all people complete in Christ. I think I'd rather have some people like my next door neighbor. I'd just as soon if he wasn't saved. He really bugs me. If he got to heaven, he'd bug me forever. And you think about that and say, no, give me a break. All people complete in Christ. There is never a moment you have to wonder, what in the world am I supposed to do? I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to present all people complete in Christ, including yourself. That's basically an easy way to summarize your internal and external calling. Do you ever have to wonder about that? No. So what about your personal specific calling? Do you ever wonder about that? Yes, obviously. That's why we're having this whole discussion. And all I'd like to point out is the most important and most fundamental elements of calling are also the most certain ones. The most important and fundamental elements are this internal and external calling. A call to salvation, a call to sanctification, and a call to service. Those things are absolutely the most foundational things, and there's never a day, there's never a morning, there's never a night when you have to wonder, what am I supposed to do here? I'll tell you what right now. You're supposed to present all people complete in Christ, including yourself. That's what you're supposed to do. So what does Paul say? Hey, I'm locked up in prison. I thought I was supposed to be a pioneer missionary church planner. Have you ever realized how hard it is to do pioneer church planning when you're in prison? There's a problem. So what does he do? Well, you know what? He gets about his business of making all men complete in Christ and says, you know what? They've locked me up, and I just want you to know that it's really served to advance the gospel, so it's become known throughout the entire Praetorian Guard and to all the rest of my imprisonments for Christ. What's he doing? He's busy presenting all people complete in Christ. Is he able to fulfill the specifics of his calling? No. But he's plenty busy doing the parts that are most certain, most guaranteed. There's never a place, there's never a time where you can't work on your own holiness and sanctification, where you can't work on sharing your faith with other people. So the most important parts of calling are the most unmissable parts of calling. Regarding the parts of calling that you might miss, I would point out that yes, I think it is possible in some sense to do some missing, but here's some things to think about. Number one, God is really very capable of redirecting us. So when we mess up, is it possible for God to correct us? Well, let's reflect deeply on the life of the Apostle Paul. His primary life calling we've already identified, pioneer church planting to the Gentiles. Where do you first meet Paul? Is he busily pioneer church planting to the Gentiles? No, he's busy stoning Stephen. Talk about a swing and a miss. I mean, this guy is really a long, long way from his calling, right? So what does God do? Well, he turns up the amplifier, right? Paul's not getting it. Great. How about a vision? We'll strike him blind. We'll knock him down on the ground. We'll have a visitation from Jesus. We'll turn up the volume and he'll get it. And guess what? He did get it. He got the message loud and clear. So I think the issue of saying, can we miss it? Yes, you can be in the process of missing it, but I think God will faithfully turn up the volume until you do hear it. At the end of the day, you can always refuse God and suffer the consequences of that. But the idea that God is going to just be whispering, oh, you didn't hear that one. I'll write it underneath his desk. I bet he won't look. You know, what are you thinking? This is not a buried treasure you're questing after. This isn't the Holy Grail that's been hidden for 2,000 years. This is a calling. If you don't get it the first time, he'll call back. He might even text you if he has to. There's no telling what he might break out. So he is able to get the message. The goal here when you're worried about calling is just not to close down your hearing. Keep listening. Don't worry so much about missing your calling. Worry about stopping your hearing, because God is very, very capable of turning up the volume. The other thing is that, generally speaking, God is particularly good at steering moving objects, not parked cars. And you've probably heard people talk about, you can't steer a parked car. Good observation. I have an even better observation. It doesn't matter if you do steer a parked car because it's parked, right? Hey, I'm going to turn the wheels all the way to the right. Wonderful. Now what's happened? Nothing, because it's parked. So until the thing's moving, why bother steering? It doesn't do anything. So by all means, if you don't have the direction yet, I don't encourage you to sit around and do nothing. Paul is sitting here in Acts chapter 16. He goes out, just had the big blow up with Barnabas. He's moving across through Turkey, and he's feeling unsettled about where he's supposed to go. So he's bouncing along through Asia Minor, and then finally, after 2 or 3 stops in this missionary journey, where he's doing what? Faithfully preaching the gospel. Just like I said, he doesn't know what else to do. He's going to preach the gospel, try and present all people complete in Christ. Middle of the night, he gets a vision. A man from Macedonia saying, Paul, come over to us. And he says, the Macedonian call. I just got one. Oh, wait, this is it. So he hops on a boat and he goes to Macedonia. Interesting move. When he did that, guess where the advance of the gospel went from to? Where was it to begin with? Asia Minor. When he got off the boat, where was he? Europe. And I just want you to think of the significance of that move for the advance of the gospel in the past 2,000 years. From where was it that the gospel ended up spreading to all the world? From Turkey? From Jerusalem? From Europe. The European converts, Rome, Greek, Spanish, that whole continent, ultimately German, English, American missionaries, all from the European side, are the place from which the gospel ended up spreading to the entire world. Really good thing that Paul answered the call. But notice he didn't answer the call while twiddling his thumbs. He answered the call while busily preaching where he was preaching, being faithful where he was there to be. He was pressing on. And then God steered a guy who was already busy pressing on. And amazing things happened that were far beyond any of the consequences Paul would have ever known. I don't think when Paul died he ever thought anything particularly special one way or another about the fact that he preached in both Europe and Asia. Whatever, he was working his way around the Mediterranean world. But in the grand scheme of human history, it was enormously important that he got that call. So yeah, I think in some sense you can need redirection from God, but the thing you want to remember is that God is perfectly capable of giving that kind of redirection, and he's perfectly faithful to do it. And you have also promises like, Psalm 138:8, he will accomplish what concerns me. Interesting phrase. God is at work in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure, Philippians 2:12 and 13. That idea that you're not working on all this alone, but you're working conjointly with God, and he will be faithful to lead you to the places that you really need to be. So the missing the calling thing doesn't really cause me a lot of stress. When people ask me or are worried about that, I'm saying, you know what, just don't turn off your cell phone and you'll get the call, okay? It will come. So get busy in the meantime being faithful where you are. Get the car moving so that the steering will matter. Another thing here, so how do you discern God's calling? How do you recognize it? That was one of the items there, and I really want to talk about that one. I've got a couple others here, but I don't want to leave that out. So let me just... So, interesting quick observations from 1 Samuel 3. So this is the thing where Samuel's sitting there in Eli's house in the tabernacle, and he hears this voice in the night saying, hey, So he bops up and said, here I am, and he goes to Eli and says, here I am. And Eli's like, I didn't call you, go back to sleep. So they go back and forth 3 times, and finally it's like, you know what, I think something's going on. Eli, may not have been exactly a flash of lightning, but sooner or later he tuned in. Something's going on here. He says, so next time you hear this thing, you say, here I am, Lord, and, see what he has to say. Interesting as you read through that, I won't take the time to do that because we won't get through all this if I do, but 3 or 4 patterns that occur in that passage I think are actually, I'm not going to exegete these into a universal law, I'm just going to point out these are 3 or 4 things that happen I think are actually fairly good general principles. Number 1 is a repeated calling. Isn't that interesting? God called once, Samuel didn't answer, I'm out of here. That isn't what happened. This is just my point about saying just keep listening. God will keep repeating. God will keep turning. Whatever it takes to get your attention, as long as you're willing, he will speak and you will hear and it'll be fine. And this is a great example of that. He goes at it 3 or 4 times before we actually ever get a conversation with Samuel. And you have a similar thing with multiple fleeces for Gideon. Make it dry, make it wet. God seems remarkably willing to go along with that. Repeated confirmations with Abraham having a hard time believing after 25 years he's actually going to have a kid. And God keeps working with him with his problems. He doesn't seem to mind repeating himself. Another thing that happened with the Samuel case that I think is not that bad a principle for validating a call is the unexpected nature of the calling. In other words, this isn't exactly the thing that you would have thought would have happened or that you would have talked yourself into happening. It's one thing to say, gee, I'd like to get a message from God. It's another thing to have that message from God be, by the way, tell Eli that because of his flake-brained sons, he's going to lose the priesthood and he's going to die and his sons are going to die and everything's going to be a living disaster, okay? So if you're thinking of messages that Samuel might think up, that one would be way down the list. This is not the kind of thing he would have manufactured on his own. He wasn't expecting to get a message at all, and when he did get the message, it wasn't the kind of message he would have wanted to think up. I remember this happening to me when I was in India, getting a call to be a pastor. And on my list of things that I wanted to do, pastor was not one of them. I was a chemistry major, right? I was planning on going to biochemistry school. I thought I would work with chemicals because chemicals don't talk back. There were so many virtues of being a chemist. And I had somewhat of a Damascus Road experience with God about going into the ministry. And when I looked at that, when I thought about that, one of the things that made me feel like this really is from God, it never sounds as distant of a possibility when I'm telling you after having been a pastor for 20 years and standing here as a Bible teacher that it was so unthinkable. Just trust me on this one. For me at that time, it was unthinkable and unthought of. It had never passed through my mind. And part of what was so jarring and sticking about that moment, which I can still remember on the afternoon of September 23rd, 1980, I still remember that moment. Partly because it was just like getting hit by a car that came out of nowhere and you didn't see it coming until after you were scraping yourself off the hood. This idea, I was in India, I was doing missionary work in India, which was totally fine with my life program. I never had a problem serving God, and just the idea of doing it vocationally, particularly as a pastor, was not on my list. So I'm there, this guy who was an Indian pastor, goes by me. He was a pastor of this really big Anglo-Indian church in Madras. So Madras is kind of Los Angeles of India. So he was actually fairly well-to-do by Indian standards. He had a car and he had a driver. And I had a bicycle. So I'm pedaling along on my bicycle after we had this meeting at this place. He goes driving by in his car, and as he drives by, I look up. I didn't know it was him, but I look up, I see the car, I see it's him, and then he's waving at me through the back of the little window in the car, and I'm pedaling along on my bike, and I go, oh, isn't that cute? The old pastor goes by in his car, and the new pastor's pedaling along on his bike. And all that had gone through my mind before I ever realized, Rick, you just called yourself a pastor. I practically drove off the road at that point. And we had this is the reason I remember September 23rd is my birthday. And we had been in India for about 4 or 5 months at that point. And so we decided we've got to go do something American. So we had drummed up a cheeseburger barbecue. Try and find a cheeseburger in India. I'm telling you, they're a little testy about what you do with their cows. So we had drummed up some hamburger. They had this whole thing. And I come home and I am like, guys, I'm sorry, but I have to sit down and journal this stuff out. So I spent about 3 hours writing in my journal about all of this stuff. It was just really deeply impressed upon my heart at that moment. And basically that journal entry pretty darn close to describes the last 35 years of my life. It was just this incredibly powerful sense from God that this is what I needed to do. I'd been spending most of the previous year and a half trying to figure out what I was going to do when I got back from this overseas junket I was on. And I had gone from applying to graduate school before I left, and I actually had admissions waiting for me to come back and take it, to going to medical school. So I was trying to figure out, could I take the GRE or the MCATs in India while I was there. I was going through all this thing, sweating bullets, and then all of a sudden God just decided to talk. And the thing, I guess why I'm telling you God can talk is because he talked to me. And I just realized I was all the time, I was happy to do whatever God told me to do. But he wasn't seeming to tell me much, so I just kept plugging, doing what I was doing. I think God was perfectly fine with that. The point is, when he decided it was time to talk, I was like, oh my gosh. Now when he's talking, I'm not only responding, but I'm turning 180 degrees from what I thought I needed to do. Had a really interesting conversation with my dad when I came home from India.
How old are you?
My research scientist dad when I came home from India. I was 22. So anyhow, that was how that story went for me. And it really does leave me with a sense of God's ability to speak to us when we're willing to hear. And part of what confirmed that for me was this unexpected nature of it. It just was not there. Does it always have to be that way? No, not at all. In fact, if I were to think of other things, when I changed from being a pastor to being a professor, there was nothing unexpected about that. I could have talked to 10 of my friends. I did talk to 10 of my friends. I didn't make the decision on my own. I talked to the people I knew best, and basically if they'd said, Rick, don't do it, and I wouldn't have done it. But the point is, it sounds really natural. It sounded right. It sounded like it made sense. And all I'm making the observation is sometimes these things, when you're really wondering, is this a word from God or is it something else? It's that unexpected flavor of it that makes you stop and think, this might be one I really need to pay attention to. Doesn't mean it's the only thing you care about, but I think it's a good thing to pay attention to when it happens that way. The next thing he did with it, interesting enough, Eli, he gets that message, but then in effect that message is confirmed by someone older and wiser, in this case Eli himself. He comes back and gives it to Eli and he says, sounds right. And you got to admit, that's a little breathtaking because you've just given him this word of condemnation. Says, he's the Lord, let him do what is right, what seems right in his eye. I believe that's the phrase that he gives after Samuel reports, because Samuel doesn't want to tell him. Eli practically, well, he does. He just commands him, tell me and don't hold anything back. Give me the truth. So he does, and Eli hears it and he says, yep, sounds like God. So it had external confirmation, not just internal. Yeah, Stephanie.
What's kind of interesting about that is it comes from a time where there was a cease of God
Yeah.
speaking. And so it's like, I don't know, that just kind of is interesting.
The idea that God would be speaking that point was a little bit weird. That was a time when the visions had ceased, and it's kind of like, what's going on. So yes, that was another part of the unexpected element. And then the other thing that this vision that Samuel had was very much compatible with God's moral will and other revealed teaching. So what was the problem? What was the message? It was attached to a batch of guys who were cheating, breaking all the laws, exploiting the people, doing all the things wrong that you shouldn't be doing. And this is a message that comes in judgment out people who are doing the things that are wrong, and their wrongness is already confirmed by external biblical teaching. And so you realize this message is not coming out from nowhere. It is something deeply compatible with biblical revelation, and that's the kind of message that he gives. So those are some of those elements that you might think of for confirming a call. If I had to, well, actually, that's a pretty darn good list. And as long as you're thinking, when you're thinking the biblical revelation and the confirmation by older and wiser people, the idea of attaching this to a broader church community. This isn't a thing you want to do in isolation. Don't read your Bible in isolation. Don't make your decisions in isolation. Ultimately, it is your decision, but it's not your decision to make alone. It's not your decision to make in silence. Hear the word of others. And there may be times when you're nonetheless called to do something other than that. You just want to be really, really careful in those times to be absolutely sure you've really heard the word of the Lord, because I don't think the normal process is to work outside of those kind of boundaries. Yeah. One other thing with finding your calling that I think is misunderstood, and that attaches to the nature of calling itself. So this comes from Martin Luther, one of the great Protestant theologians of calling. Huge issue in the Protestant Reformation, and Luther was very, very influential in developing the notion of calling that for most of us we take as somewhat commonplace. Pre-Reformation time, the only people that had a call would be people who were priests. By definition, a call meant a priestly call. For Luther, he says, look, the milkmaid milking and the farmer farming and the cobbler cobbling are all every bit as much fulfilling their calling as the priest is. And in fact, in Luther's case, generally more so than the priest because of his attitude towards priests and especially monks. But one of the things that Luther talked about was a person's Lebensstand, which Leben is the German word for life. Stand is, multi-purpose word, but in this case it means something like a state or situation in life, your life setting. So for example, for me, what would my Lebensstand be? Well, part of it is that I am a teacher vocationally. I am a citizen of the United States. I'm also a citizen of the city of Redlands, my local community. I'm attached to a body of believers. I'm married to a wife. I have 2 children, and I have a whole set of community, friends, and relationships that depend on me and upon whom I depend. These are all part of my Lebensstand. In medieval Germany, a person would have had his guild, his city, his church, his prince, whoever he was attached to in that sort of feudal structure. All of those things are kind of givens of your situation. They're classic 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 23, that passage I read about, the calling in which you find yourself situated. Are you a slave? Are you free? What are you? Classic Lebensstand kinds of issues. Luther's point is, in effect, that every one of those constitutes a calling on your life. And indeed, you would be better off thinking about your callings, not simply your call. And one of our problems today is I think we have over-invested in the quality of life that we think should come from our jobs, and we have underinvested in the quality of life that we would understand coming from every other aspect of our Lebensstand, of our estate, our situation in life. So we want every bit of meaning and purpose and joy and success and all these other things to be attached to our vocational job. Luther's like, why? Why should your job be that big a deal? A Greek would come to you and say, why would you think your job would be that way instead of your friends? Wouldn't your friendship be a bigger place that you would find meaning in life than your job? Whoa, that's creepy. Most people, for most of the time, would see their attachment to their family as being an enormous thing constituting the quality of their life, what makes their life good or bad. So when you report on your calling, how's your calling going? Modern Americans would probably hear that as a little bit unusual phrase, but you'd immediately translate into how's my job, and you tell them about your job. What Luther is in effect telling you says you shouldn't be asking about your calling, you should be asking about your callings. And when you answer the question, how's my life going right now? And you say, well, my job calling stinks. Okay, great. My wife calling, my relation with my wife right now is great. My relation with my kids has never been better. How's your relationship with your church? Well, church is going pretty good. I've got some places I'm serving, but I'm really kind of getting tired of the fact that we still are doing worship with organs, and I wish we were doing it with drums. So, that kind of bugs me. What about your community? Hate my community. 68 miles from my job, a little shaky. Well, what about your citizenship? I'm thrilled to pieces to be an American. And so how's your life? How's your callings? You go, on balance, I guess I'm doing pretty good. And man, I'll tell you, I wish I could bring in this one, I could actually bring in this one friend of mine, but he doesn't like his job. But everything else on the list I just gave you, he loves. And we were talking about this in a Bible study. This was about a year and a half ago. This was incredibly liberating to him. When it finally dawned on him, he says, you know what, I don't need to have a great job. I need to be able to feed my wife and my kids, but I've got a daughter who is never going to be able to live outside of our home. She is not going to be able to live on her own. I'm going to have to provide a lifelong source of stability, not only for my wife and myself, but for my offspring. And to have a job that pays the bills is an enormously good thing. Do I like it? Not a lot. Can I do it? Yeah, I can. Do I have a good church? Do I have a good wife? Do I have a good friendship? Do I have all these other things? Every other facet of his Lebensstand was really great. And the worst problem was he's getting a message from a culture that says, you need the perfect job. And the bottom line is, he doesn't. You don't really need the perfect one of any of those. What you need is a composite that says, this is good. God's been faithful. This is what I need. And questing for the magic job is one of the curses of our modern time. It isn't a bad thing to seek an appropriate job, a good fit, but the idea that you seek the perfect fit, and when you have the perfect fit, you'll have the perfect life, that's just simply wrong, because your calling is far more diverse than that in a biblical context. You have callings to all of these things, and they should be viewed, evaluated, and enjoyed together.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.